turn our attention to diplomacy and defense. Richard, I'm going to ask you to bring this portion of the program to closure with your comments. Obviously, over the last several years, we've witnessed numerous U.S. withdrawals from global organizations like the WHO and multilateral trade agreements like the TPP and the prospect of a withdrawal from NATO. So I'm just curious what you think the big geopolitical challenges are, and how do you think differing foreign policy agendas will affect the United States' power to influence the global agenda?
In terms of diplomacy, the differences will be profound in most areas. I think the biggest difference with the Biden administration will probably be two. One would be a far greater willingness to work with partners and allies, much less unilateral. The basic instinct of a Biden administration when there's a challenge is to go to others and work with others in Europe and Asia in particular, unlike the Trump administration, whose basic instinct has been to keep allies at bay and act unilaterally. And second of all, there's a belief in multilateralism, and I believe in the Biden camp. So you'll see a rejoining of certain agreements, institutions. The Trump administration, since I coined the phrase, the withdrawal doctrine, I don't see that changing. In my experience, rarely do second-term presidents move dramatically away from what they did in their first term and they believe got them reelected. So I do think there'd be actually a significant difference. That said, as I pointed out before, a lot of the institutions that are out there aren't adequate. So a big question for a Biden administration won't be whether they rejoin this or that agreement, but whether they can come up with better agreements or better institutions that show more promise to deal with regional or global challenges. Where I don't think there'll be some enormous differences are such things as probably moving closer to India. I think that's been a trend that's been in existence for several decades. Implicit in that is also a very difficult relationship with China. Might be different emphases, trade, human rights, South China Sea, Taiwan. But I think this is a very difficult relationship going forward, no matter who wins here. One big reason is because of Xi Jinping. He's a very different kind of leader domestically and internationally. This is a more repressive China at home, a more assertive China abroad. We are going to have to deal with that. Mr. Putin is not going to change his spots, and whoever wins the election is going to have to deal with the fact that in February, the principal nuclear arms control agreement is due to expire. So there's issues there. Whoever gets elected is going to have to deal with North Korea and Iran. I think the different approach would be, I think the Biden administration would likely, I say likely, be more willing to embrace traditional approaches to diplomacy and arms control. Mr. Trump basically hasn't, whether it's his personal diplomacy with North Korea or his approach to Iran, which is essentially rejected diplomacy and instead try to bring about regime change through sanctions. Again, I think a Biden approach would be much more traditional diplomacy. Let me say one last point. Whoever is elected, whoever sits in the Oval Office come January, and I'll make the assumption that they're not sharing the Oval Office come January. At some point, there will be a clear winner in this election. He is going to face a reality where the domestic demands on the president are going to be enormous. COVID-19 will still be raging. Millions of people unemployed, deep political divisions, possibly worse political divisions than ever if the election is seen by 45% of America as tainted or illegitimate, racial divisions that are deep and so forth. So one of the challenges on the foreign policy side will be essentially getting the focus there, because there'll be a tremendous pull, almost a gravitational pull on who's ever sitting in the Oval Office to deal with things here at home. Now, obviously, ultimately, that's part of national security as well. We can't be effective in the world. We can't set a good example to the world if we don't have things here at home working fairly well. But I do think that will limit certain things that we're prepared to do in the world. And I think but I do think even here, though, there'd be a difference where Mr. Trump would be much more willing, consistent with what I said before, to pull back troops from alliances. He's already started in Europe. He could continue in Europe. He could add that to Asia, whereas I do not think Mr. Biden would go down that path. Mr. Biden, I believe, would be much more inclined to support a lot of the foreign policy infrastructure, the core infrastructure in Europe and Asia, that I would argue has served this country extraordinarily well for 75 years. Mr. Trump's default option is to disrupt. I do not believe that is shared by Mr. Biden.